After almost 5 years of war and the loss of nearly 4,000 U.S. troops, the U.S. military commander in Iraq, General David Petraeus, said this week Iraq's leaders so far have failed to take full advantage of the reduction in violence that resulted from the so-called military surge in troops. And there are new reports that show that violence is actually beginning to increase somewhat as the frontline troops start to head home. So where is the U.S. in Iraq after 5 years? Joining us now to discuss this is Ambassador Paul Bremmer. He was the director of the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq during those crucial years immediately after the invasion. Spent a year working there. Ambassador, thanks for coming back.
Good to be with you, Wolf.
You write in the New York Times today on the op-ed page this. I'll read it to our viewers. Pre-war planning provided for fewer than half the number of troops that independent studies suggested would be needed in Iraq. And we did not have a plan to provide the most basic function of any government, security for the population. I would have pushed sooner for a more effective military strategy because from 2004 to the end of 2007, al-Qaeda took advantage of this gap. Those are three important points that you made in that little paragraph right there. Why weren't there enough troops deployed to begin with?
Well, you know, Wolf, I think part of the problem, both in terms of the number of troops and the strategy, involved a legitimate concern on the part of the military leaders, particularly the Army, that they would become overstretched. And indeed, it put a lot of strain, not only in the regular Army, but as we've seen on the National Guard and on the reserves.
It was General Shinseki, who was the chief of the Army Chief of Staff. He wanted more troops, and he was sort of rebuked at the time by Paul Wolfowitz, among others, for even suggesting the U.S. might need hundreds of thousands as opposed to 150,000.
Well, I had the luxury of being a businessman during the run-up to the war, so I don't know what happened all during the war. I did say, before I left for Iraq, that independent studies showed we needed perhaps twice as many troops as we actually had at the time.
300,000.
Yeah, or more. And we didn't have them there, and in fact we never got them. And it's really only when the president changed the strategy and put into effect the surge a year ago that we've seen some good news on the violence front.
The second point, you say, we did not have a plan to provide the most basic function of any government. There was a plan in place that retired General Jay Garner would go in and start to deal with the civilian infrastructure or whatever immediately after the military objectives were achieved. There was a plan. What was the problem, though?
Well, the plan for reconstruction was based on, as it turned out, false assumptions. We assumed there would be large-scale humanitarian disaster. We assumed Saddam would set fire to the oil wells. We assumed there would be large-scale refugee movements inside the country. None of these things actually happened. So General Garner, who was a wonderful, patriotic man, found himself in a situation where the planning that had been done before the war was based on assumptions.
And that's when they sent you in.
Well, that's when I arrived, and I found that, in fact, the situation on the ground was far worse than we thought. The economy was completely devastated, and we had quite a job trying to reconstruct it.
The basic criticism leveled against you is that you took charge instead of letting Iraqis take charge.
Well, I've seen that argument. I just don't agree with it. Within 60 days of my arrival, we put in place an interim Iraqi government. I gave them full authority. They appointed the ministers who ran the government for the rest of the time I was there. I never overruled a minister my entire time I was there, though I had the authority to do it.
Here's what Richard Pearl writes in the same page of the New York Times today, and I want to give you a chance to respond. With misplaced confidence that we knew better than the Iraqis, we sent an American to govern Iraq. L. Paul Bremer underestimated the task, but did his best to make a foolish policy work. I had badly underestimated the administration's capacity to mess things up. Those are pretty strong words from someone who was seen as a major architect of this whole strategy.
Well, I know Richard, and his views deserve to be heard. He's a respected observer. I think he's actually wrong because he makes the case in this article, you didn't put that part up, that we should have simply handed over right away to a group of exiles. The problem with that is, first of all, the exiles were unpopular or unknown in Iraq.
Al-Chalabi, among others.
Among others. They were unrepresented. There were no women among the exiles we were talking to, no Christians. The Sunnis were underrepresented, and of course we knew we had to get the Sunnis involved. So the president decided, actually before I came into government, correctly, on a longer-term process, which admittedly meant a longer occupation, but which gave the Iraqis a chance to put in place the political program that they've followed since then, elections, a constitution, and so forth. So I think the president's decision was the right one. It's the one we followed.
there's another book that's about to be released by Doug Feith, who was a top civilian official at the Pentagon, also seen as one of the architects of this strategy. The book is not yet out, but the Washington Post obtained a copy and wrote this on March 9th. Bremmer is said to have done more harm than good. The key mistake that the United States made in Iraq, Feith asserts, was the mishandling of the political transition. The good that Bremer did, he concludes, was outweighed by the harm caused by the fact of occupation. Now, you want to respond to that criticism from Doug Feith?
I do. It sounds like the architects are running away from their building here. Well, it's the same point. Basically, what Feith is saying is we should have simply handed over right away to a group of unrepresentative exiles, and I just disagree. I think the president's decision to take the time to build the political structure was the right one. You had a country which had no constitution, no electoral law. There had been no comprehensive census for half a century. We needed to help them put in place the basics of the rule of law and a constitution, and we took the time to do that, and I think it was the right thing to do.
When we spoke when your book came out, My Year in Iraq, you wrote in the book, I'm concerned that a lot of the Pentagon's frenetic push on the political stuff is meant to set me up as the fall guy. You want to elaborate on what you meant when you wrote that? Would you see yourself as having been set up as the fall guy?
A lot of the pressure to immediately hand over to these exiles that we just talked about came to the fore in September and October of 2003, and the comments that you're quoting from my book were in that time frame when, in effect, some of the people in the Pentagon, including Mr. Feith, were pushing very hard to simply turn over and get out. And I felt that was irresponsible, and I told the president I thought it was irresponsible. In the end, the president agreed with me.
Let's look ahead now, where we go from here, the next 5 years, presumably. In your book, My Year in Iraq, you wrote this: your guys don't seem to understand how ineffective the Iraqi government is turning out to be. Those people couldn't organize a parade, let alone run a country. That was your initial sense right after the military phase, was completed. Are they any better today, the Iraqi government of Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki? Can they get their act together and do what they need to do?
I think they can. I mean, after all, they've had 3 Iraqi governments now, 2 of them elected. That's pretty rare in the region. They're working under a constitution which is progressive and better than any constitution in the region. It's just a piece of paper, and they've got to live up to it. I know the Prime Minister. I don't know him well. I knew him as an assistant to some of the other leaders. I think he's doing as good a job as he can in a very difficult situation. Reconciliation in situations like this is not easy, particularly after the Sunni domination of Iraq for several millennia. It's not easy.
If I want you to respond to Barack Obama. He said this on Thursday, looking ahead, if he were president, as far as his strategy in Iraq. Listen.
The strategy of invading Iraq has been and continues to be a strategic failure of enormous proportions. My conclusion is that at an enormous cost of blood and treasure that has also weakened our economy, it hasn't made us more safe.
All right, what do you think?
Well, I respectfully disagree with the senator. I think under the circumstances the president faced and the country faced in 2003, with our intelligence agencies and the agencies of France, Germany, Russia, Israel, Britain, all thinking that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction and concerned about the possibility that al-Qaeda terrorists, Islamic extremists, would get their hands on this stuff, I think the decision to go into Iraq was the right one at the time.
Still think it was the right decision?
Yes, I do.
Despite everything we now know, yes, that there were no weapons of mass destruction, that any connection between al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein was very minimal, if there was anything serious there, you still think it was the right thing to do?
I do. I think it was the right thing to do, and I think Iraq is, in fact, on the road now to becoming, it will take time, a democratic government in the middle of the Middle East, which is itself quite an accomplishment. So I respectfully disagree with the senator, and I think it's not clear. He makes the argument, I don't think it's true that we are less safe than we were before. I don't think that's true. We have lost almost 4,000 Americans' lives there, and that's a tragic cost that we've had to pay.
Ambassador Bremmer, thanks for coming in.
Good to be with you.